everyone. This is My Two Cents. Today I'm going to be debunking a video called Why You Should Be Socialist, put out by a channel called The Right to Reason. This gentleman basically rehashes some commonly believed misconceptions about the Great Depression, and then concludes that because socialism saved the US from the Great Depression, allegedly, you should be a socialist today. Now, before we begin, let me just say that this first video, I'm going to respond specifically to the claims he makes about the Great Depression. I will make a second video that will then deal with those claims he makes after that are specifically about socialism. I'd like to begin this video with a quote from the book that everyone ought to read, The Politically Incorrect Guide to the Great Depression and the New Deal. If you're a typical American, you learned that the 1920s were a period of wildcat speculation, where the little guy was at the mercy of unregulated big business. You learned that the excesses of naked capitalism led to a great stock market crash, a horrific economic contraction, and skyrocketing unemployment. You learned that Herbert Hoover did nothing to alleviate the crisis, merely gazing coolly from his White House office as the laissez-faire market economy collapsed upon itself. You learned that the American people demanded government help and voted overwhelmingly for Franklin D. Roosevelt, whose stirring words provided hope and whose revolutionary programs provided recovery. Finally, to the extent that your education deviated from the above account, you learned that it was World War II, not FDR, that actually pulled the United States out of the Great Depression. Every single element of this official narrative is utterly false, and any honest researcher who bothered to check his primary sources would have known it. Now, as author Robert Murphy suggests, there is indeed a great deal of misinformation about the Great Depression floating around, especially in the wake of the 2008 housing crisis and President Bush and Obama's use of the Great Depression to justify their interventionist actions in the economy. However, I noticed that Mr. Stanley did not cite a single source for any of the claims that he makes about the Great Depression, other than one chart and a couple of video clips. We'll find that as we review his statements, that if he had indeed done a little research, he would have known that his claims are indeed utterly false. So let's watch, and by the time we're done, you'll know why you should not be a socialist.
In today's Right to Reason, I am going to tell you why you should be a socialist.
We'd like to thank you for really showing us the way. We'd like to thank you for Hoover. You made us what we are today.
In 1976, the popular Annie musical portrayed the reality of shantytowns built by the homeless known as Hoovervilles. The play was actually based on a Harold Gray's Little Orphan Annie from the 20s, but it's the 20s and 30s that I want to talk to you about today, specifically 1929 to 1939, the era known as the Great Depression. Despite what many economists may argue about, the Great Depression did not have one cause. Hoover, for example, was blamed by the populace, while he blamed World War I. Both arguments have their own legitimate points, but we'll focus on the economics of the time and let you draw your own conclusions first off.
Well, he is right. The Great Depression didn't have one cause. However, I believe that the pertinent question when studying the Great Depression is not what caused the Great Depression, but rather why did it last as long as it did? When we examine this question, we'll find that it was government trying to tinker with the economy, combined with the Federal Reserve banking system, that was responsible for both why the Great Depression happened and why it lasted as long as it did. Let's go over some quick history that led up to the Great Depression. First, the Federal Reserve Bank of the United States was created in 1913 by the Federal Reserve Act. After the United States had experienced a stock market crash and bank run crisis several years earlier in 1907, the idea was that having a centralized bank with exclusive control over the nation's monetary policy could prevent similar economic crises in the future. It is beyond the scope of this video to go into all the things that make the Fed one of the biggest scams ever hoisted on the world. Mike Maloney has an excellent video explaining this, which I will link in the description. Here are a few pertinent facts, however, about Basic Economics 101 and the historical events leading up to the Great Depression. First, currency, like gold, silver, or any other commodity, is only valuable inasmuch as it is scarce. In other words, if there were an infinite supply of dollars in the world, no one would be willing to exchange goods for dollars, since every person would be able to have as many dollars as they wanted. This is why gold and silver have been recognized as valuable by virtually every culture in human history. These metals are finite in amount and difficult to acquire, which means they can't be manipulated when used as money. Paper currency, however, can be manipulated when a centralized bank like the Fed has the exclusive power to create it. When the Fed or any other central bank creates more currency, inflation occurs. Prices respond to inflation like a sponge soaking up water. The first buyers to use the newly created currency will get lucky and be able to buy goods for standard prices. But as more and more people come out to do some shopping with the newly created currency, the prices of all goods and services will rise to compensate for the increased demand. This will often trick investors into thinking that their assets are more valuable than they actually are, and they will seek to sell off some of their assets, such as stocks, in order to make a profit. However, this can't last forever. As prices rise, production costs also rise, and will continue to rise until business owners are no longer making profits. It is at this point that recessions occur as a natural part of the market cycle. Think of a recession like getting an illness that can be cured, but only if one goes to the doctor, takes prescribed medication, and takes a few days off of work. This may be a huge inconvenience for some people, and as a result, they choose to forego the doctor and simply take aspirin or other over-the-counter medication to rid themselves of their symptoms. This may work for a while. However, left untreated, the illness will only get worse and worse, and eventually the sick person will have to go see the doctor. By this point, however, it will take them far longer to recover than if they'd simply gone to the doctor when the illness first afflicted them. So it is when governments try to tinker with the economy in order to prevent recessions. All this does is kick the can down the road, as it were. Government bailouts, like the ones that occurred in 2008, might quote-unquote save the economy from a disastrous recession, but they only guarantee that an even worse one will occur later. You'd be better off simply letting recessions happen and let the market correct itself naturally, as President Harding did in a seldom talked about recession that occurred in 1921. See link in description to learn more about this. During World War I, the Fed printed money in order to finance the war effort, as did the Bank of England. This caused inflation, just like we talked about. However, since the United States was not involved in the war until the final year, the inflation was not nearly as bad as it was in Britain. In 1924, the Fed took actions to help assist the British economy by inflating the dollar and deflating the pound. They lowered interest rates, expanding credit, and creating more U.S. currency. As this currency made its way into the economy and more people came out to spend the new money, the period of prosperity known as the Roaring Twenties ensued. However, as we just discussed, economic expansion caused by inflation cannot last forever. If a central bank simply continues to inject more and more money into the economy, hyperinflation can occur, such as it did in post-World War I Germany, where the currency becomes virtually worthless. The Fed's expansions of the 1920s were doomed to end in another recession, as was in fact predicted by several noted economists. In 1929, fearing hyperinflation, the Fed reversed its policy, raising interest rates and contracting the money supply. Like all decisions made by the Fed, it takes time for the market at large to react to the changes in monetary policy. The Fed shareholders, knowing what was coming, were able to sell their assets off before the recession when prices were still high. However, in October of that year, when it became clear what was happening, everyone else began selling as fast as they could, hoping to cut their losses before the prices dropped, and then again before they dropped even lower. The stock market crashed, and it is here that many people say that the Great Depression officially began. However, it is important to note that things were not as bad at this point as they would be later. In 1930, the unemployment rate reached 8.7%. Remember that figure, because it's going to be important later.
Banks were small individual institutions that couldn't handle the massive unemployment and constant drop of farm prices. In response, the Fed began raising rates and continued raising them even after the Depression had begun. Hoover didn't do much to reverse this crumbling system because he was passionately invested in this idea that government shouldn't be involved in the country's economy, that the invisible hand would kind of clean up everything for us. Might sound familiar. That's the libertarian conservative viewpoint that you'll hear today.
This is abjectly false. If only Hoover had chosen to simply let the free market work. Instead, Hoover insisted on fixing the economy through the force of government. In late 1929, Hoover convened a series of conferences in Washington. The first was held at the White House on November 21, 1929. Hoover met with 24 industrial leaders in the morning and 12 labor leaders in the afternoon. During these conferences, Hoover asked industrial leaders to forswear wage cuts during the downturn, among other items of discussion. Similarly, in the afternoon, Hoover asked labor leaders to forswear wage increase proposals. The result, public pledges by both sides to uphold Hoover's requests, was dubbed Hoover's Truce by the press. The second conference, held on December 5, 1929, titled the National Business Survey Conference, was held with over 400 business leaders, mostly firm executives and trade association presidents. This was essentially a larger scale version of the November 21 conference, but targeted at an industry level rather than a firm level, and Hoover again asked those present to maintain high wages. Essentially, Hoover asked business owners not to cut jobs or wages, despite the fact that this is what the law of supply and demand would dictate in response to the falling prices brought on by deflation. If this weren't bad enough, however, Hoover signed into law the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act of 1930. This raised taxes on imported foreign goods to higher levels than they had been in more than 100 years. Foreign countries, of course, responded by raising tariffs on imported U.S. goods, virtually putting an end to foreign trade and drastically lowering the demand for American-produced industrial goods. Lower demand, of course, means even lower prices. However, since Hoover had demanded that industry keep their wages high and forego layoffs, despite the fact that lower prices were not bringing in the necessary profits to maintain this, Hoover's plan was doomed to fail. Eventually, businesses were forced to close, and the unemployment rate soared to more than 23% in 1932. Hoover tried to counter this by increasing government spending on public works, such as the Hoover Dam, in hopes that this would stimulate the economy and create more jobs. However, nothing in life comes free. Someone had to foot the bill for the increased government spending, which prompted Hoover to double the income tax overall and raise the income tax on the top bracket of income earners from 25% to 63%. Of course, robbing Peter to pay Paul can never ultimately fix the economy. As the entire nation felt the burden of increased taxes, people had less money to spend, and the economy tanked even worse. So yeah, Hoover was totally a free market capitalist who didn't do anything to try and fix the economy.
But I digress. Let me get back to my point here. That's when the dominoes began to fall. The feds keep raising the rates. Everyone goes into bankruptcy. They start losing their homes. Investors pull their money from the bank. Banks fold. This causes panic. Because of the panic, people stop putting their money in the banks, therefore decreasing the money supply, and everybody's screwed.
Well, he is right that the Fed continued contracting the money supply. Allegedly, it had been created to step in and save failing banks, as J.P. Morgan had done personally in 1907. However, despite the fact that that is what it had been created to do, it refused to do so all throughout the Great Depression.
To explain it from a philosophical point of view, here's everybody's favorite Zen master, Alan Watts.
This was the situation of the Great Depression, when here we were still, in a material sense, a very rich country, with plenty of fields and farms and mines and factories, everything going. But suddenly, because of a psychological hang-up, because of a mysterious mumbo-jumbo about the economy, about the banking, we were all miserable and poor, starving in the midst of plenty, just because of a psychological hang-up. And that hang-up is that money is real, and that people ought to suffer in order to get it. But the whole point of the machine is to relieve you of that suffering. It is an ingenuity. You see, we are psychologically back in the 17th century and technically in the 20th.
Yeah, that mumbo-jumbo he's talking about was, as I've already demonstrated, Herbert Hoover trying to fix the economy instead of letting the free market naturally recover, and the Federal Reserve failing to do the very thing it had been supposedly created to do.
Then, something awesome happened. In 1932, the country elected Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He immediately drops the New Deal on the country, creating 42 new agencies, job creation, unionization, unemployed insurance, Social Security, the SEC. He even gave all the banks those cute little gold placards that say FDIC insured, because you need those. Socialism saved your country.
Socialism saved the country? He leaves out some important details about FDR. FDR seized private gold from U.S. citizens, ultimately devaluing the U.S. dollar an additional 40%. He brought on a minimum wage, set the work week at 35 hours, and passed labor laws restricting the ability of minors to have jobs. In my response to George Cook, I've already explained why minimum wage and restricted work weeks only snuffs out competition, ultimately leading to fewer jobs and more unemployment. See link in the description. In 1933, unemployment nearly reached 25%. While it began to slowly drop after that, unemployment again spiked to 19% in 1938, 5 years after the New Deal had begun. So tell me, if the New Deal was so great, why were unemployment rates still drastically higher than they had been in 1930, shortly after the Depression had begun? Remember, they only peaked at 8.7% then. The New Deal had 5 years to work, for crying out loud, and unemployment rates were at 19%.
Now, many anti-socialists would tell you the exact opposite from what you'll find in every macroeconomics textbook in every college around America, that the war, specifically World War II, saved us from the Great Depression instead of President Frankie. This is common propaganda from the powers that be trying to convince you that killing one another is going to make you richer.
Okay, it wasn't the war or killing that brought us out of the Great Depression. However, it was the war which ultimately caused the Fed to finally start printing money again, which after the war stimulated the economy once that money could be spent.
Take a look at this graph.
Look at this graph.
Here you can clearly see the economy was improving long before World War II. However, the rest of the world blowing itself up while we sat on the other side of the Atlantic did improve our trade industry quite a bit, as you might expect. So you have to give the warmongers a point there, although once we entered the war, we increased our national debt by about $100 billion, so we'll just take that point right back.
Ah, the graph. This graph is commonly used by the economically illiterate to try and claim that the gross national product started rising once the New Deal was implemented. While this is true, it is highly misleading because it ignores several important facts. First, high growth rates are to be expected early on if you start with nothing. For example, let's imagine I'm dirt poor and have only one measly dollar in my pocket. As I'm walking down the street, I see 4 quarters fallen into a sewer drain. Kneeling down, I pull them out and rejoice. I just went from having $1 to having $2, increasing my total assets by 100%. However, if I started going around telling people, searching for money in the streets can increase your assets by 100%, everyone would immediately realize that that was only true given I had so little to begin with, and it would not be basis for far-reaching money-making policy. Second, notice that on the graph he's shown, GNP started falling again in 1937. As I already pointed out, it was at this point that unemployment again began to rise, this being 5 years after the New Deal was implemented. In fact, it only starts to rapidly grow come 1941, when the Fed finally begins increasing the money supply once again to finance World War II costs. Once again, it was not the war itself, but how the Fed reacted to the war that caused the economy to begin growing. In fact, a good argument can be made that the Depression didn't really end until after the war. Alright, well, this video is already getting pretty long, so we'll save the rest of his comments about socialism for part 2. I think we've demonstrated pretty clearly that the right to reason has a bit of fact-checking to do before he tries to cite the Great Depression or the New Deal as an argument for socialism. Check back this Thursday for the debunking of the second part of his video. Also, Mr. Stanley, if you are watching and plan to respond, I would be interested to know what sources you researched when making your presentation. Do you know of any peer-reviewed works that are written by professional historians or economists that would confirm what you've said and refute what I've said? I'd like to know. Anyways, that is my 2 cents. Take it for what it's worth. Thanks for watching, everyone. If you liked this video, please hit like and subscribe. You can also hit the bell to make sure you're notified every time I upload a new video. To follow me on Twitter, Minds.com, VidMe, or WordPress, check out the links in the description. If you'd like to hear my 2 cents on any topic, leave a comment below. New uploads are every Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday, so stay tuned for more videos.